On the 8th of February 1587, inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle, the Queen of England made her way through the crowds and onto the small scaffold that had been built for her execution. She was surrounded by her ladies who remained faithful to her, who wept at every step that the former Queen took towards her date with death and the executioner. He had sharpened his axe that morning to ensure that the job to take the former Queen of Scotland's head off would be performed with efficiency and dignity. But this would not happen. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots was performed in a terrible and poor manner, and what happened to the 44-year-old former Scottish monarch was shocking. The treatment of her body afterwards was also remarkably harrowing, and was horrific, as Elizabeth I, the English Tudor Queen, debated for so long to have her rival buried as she regretted sanctioning the execution. Join us today as we look at the terrible treatment of the remains of the executed Queen of Scotland. And as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe down below. It was the Babington plot that secured Mary's execution, as she had consented to this scheme to assassinate Elizabeth I and then take the throne of England herself. Mary was imprisoned for around 2 decades when she fled Scotland and came to England, and she was held in different castles around the nation, but she was kept in comfort most of the time. But because of her treasonous activities, Mary was then sentenced to death. It took Elizabeth I a while to sanction the execution of Mary, but she was hesitant that executing another anointed queen would prevent her from one day getting into heaven. But the Privy Council then persisted, and eventually Elizabeth did sign the death warrant, and Mary was told the day before she would be executed by messengers sent on behalf of Elizabeth I that she would be executed by axe the very next day. Because of such a long imprisonment, some have said that Mary reacted to the news of her execution with not fear, but just calm, as she had enough of being imprisoned, and she longed for freedom. But her final hours were spent inside Fotheringhay Castle, getting her affairs in order, but her execution the following day did not go well. On the 8th of February 1587, Mary was summoned from her chambers, and she was told that the execution was now to occur, and she was led into the great hall of the castle, where the scaffold had been built. However, the execution as mentioned did not go very well at all. She was not executed with a single strike of the axe, and the first blow when she knelt on the scaffold and lay her head on the block missed, and hit the back of her head. The axe embedded in the back of her skull, and this blow may have killed Mary, but the job was not done. A second swing was used, and the executioner struck the neck, and it almost severed her head from her body, before a small piece of sinew, which was then sawn through by the axeman. He then picked her head up and showed it to the crowd, and said, "God save the Queen," as the gasps inside of the great hall of Fotheringhay could be heard. But when the executioner held the head up, Mary's wig slipped, and it came loose, and with this her head then fell onto the floor, and it showed that Mary had short grey hair. But then the decision was made to make sure there was a huge clean-up operation, as anything that was touched by the blood of Mary was thrown into the fire of the Great Hall, and even the block and the scaffold were thrown into the fire as firewood. All of Mary's clothes were also burned, and this stopped Catholics collecting relics from her. Elizabeth I regretted the execution of Mary Queen of Scots massively, and because of this, she believed her Privy Council had acted unlawfully in convincing her to sanction Mary's execution. She even had one of her advisers imprisoned in the Tower of London for this advice and counsel, but Mary Queen of Scots had left a number of instructions as to what should happen to her following her death, and pretty much all of these wishes of the dead monarch were ignored by Elizabeth I and the Tudors. Firstly, Mary Queen of Scots wanted to be buried with her first husband, the King of France, Francis, who died a long time before, and she wanted to be repatriated to France for the burial service. But Elizabeth did not allow this to happen, and she refused this, but it may have cost too much also to move the Queen, but also it would have been too risky, as Elizabeth greatly feared a Catholic uprising in the aftermath of her death. But Elizabeth I, due to the regret, took time to give the instructions as to what to do with Mary's body and remains. In the days following her execution, Mary's body was taken into a presence chamber or a side room inside Fotheringhay Castle, presumably in the keep, as this was more private, which was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin. Before this happened, her body was embalmed by physicians, and Mary's heart and her entrails and internal organs were cut out. They were then placed inside different caskets, and it was believed they were then buried inside of Fotheringhay Castle. These have never been found, and Elizabeth continued to take her time as to give the royal approval to the burial plans for Mary's remains, and because of this, for around 6 months, her remains lay inside of the coffin, near to where she was executed, pretty much collecting dust. The decision to then bury Mary Queen of Scots inside of Peterborough Cathedral was made, and she was not allowed to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey due to her status of being a traitor. Peterborough was chosen because it was the closest major cathedral to where she was executed, but the procession to move Mary occurred. The officers of Elizabeth I's household carefully selected the burial site, and they chose for her to be buried opposite the body of the first wife of Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, who was also a strong Catholic. But the funeral procession was large, and a hearse collected the body from Fotheringhay, and the horses pulling this were draped in black cloth. To bury the traitorous Mary, it would have cost Elizabeth I a lot of money. On the 30th of July 1587, the body was taken to the cathedral, and many of Mary's friends and loyal servants and members of her household accompanied it. This was dignified, but it was not what Mary wanted, especially as she was given a Protestant funeral, and she was a Catholic, and this was one final act of disgrace against the Scottish Queen, and it was one last sign of Elizabeth I's power over her rival. Mary was not also allowed to be buried where she wanted, and for the funeral procession, the coffin was carried into Peterborough Cathedral, which was then interred inside the burial site close to the high altar. However, this would be a resting place that would not be forever, as following the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603, Mary Queen of Scots' son James came onto the throne of England. He was already the ruler of Scotland, but James I united the two thrones and nations, which for centuries had been in a state of war at different times. James I was not the most impressed with regards to his mother's burial, and he then ordered the exhumation of his mother's coffin, but not before a huge tomb and memorial would be made for Mary inside of Westminster Abbey. The tomb in effigy shows Mary wearing a dignified coif and lace ruff, and a crowned Scottish lion is found at her feet, and she was buried actually opposite Elizabeth I, also showing that they were rivals in death. But Mary's tomb was made significantly but slightly larger than Elizabeth's. But over the years, the burial vault of Mary Queen of Scots was disturbed after her body was reinterred in this new grave. The Dean of Westminster, Arthur P. Stanley, wanted to find the coffin of James I in the 19th century, and he struggled to find the coffin of Mary's son, and he later found this inside the most prominent Tudor vaults. But to have a look for this, he actually entered the burial vault of Mary Queen of Scots. He found the coffin of Mary and her lead-lined coffin, which had been placed along the north wall of the vault, and alongside her coffin was that of many other Stuart members of the royal family, including Lady Arbella Stuart and many others. This was the last time that the coffin of Mary Queen of Scots was looked at. However, the end to Mary Queen of Scots' life was horrifically brutal. She was exhumed following the creation of this tomb, where she is still buried today, but she was a queen who endured a barbaric execution at the hands of the English monarch Queen Elizabeth I. Her execution did not go well, and it is remembered today for its botching events, and also for the terrible treatment of what happened to her remains after. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.